In the mid-20th century, Lancaster City, Pennsylvania, was a place teetering on the edge of progress and the past. Cobblestone streets echoed with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, while gas lamps flickered in the cool evening air. But beneath this veneer of quaint charm, something sinister lurked, something that had been festering for centuries. Dr. Edward Carlyle was a man of science and reason, newly arrived in Lancaster with his wife, Lillian, and their young daughter, Eliza. The good doctor had been invited to take up the position of head physician at the Lancaster Asylum, a sprawling Gothic structure that loomed ominously at the outskirts of the city. Its dark silhouette was visible from almost any point in town, a constant reminder of the suffering within its walls. The asylum had a grim reputation. Stories of mistreatment and mysterious deaths were whispered among the townsfolk. Patients would often vanish without a trace, their names quietly removed from the records. The previous head physician, Dr. Emmett Blackwood, had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, leaving behind only cryptic notes and strange symbols scrawled in his journal. Dr. Carlyle was a man of rationality, dismissing these tales as mere superstition and the product of overactive imaginations. He moved his family into a grand but eerily silent mansion close to the asylum. The house, like the asylum, had an air of neglect, its darkened windows and creaking floorboards speaking of years without tender care. One night, shortly after their arrival, Lillian was awakened by a strange noise. A soft, rhythmic tapping echoed through the halls. She nudged Edward awake, but he dismissed it as the house settling, a common occurrence in old homes. But Lillian felt a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. Days turned into weeks, and Dr. Carlyle immersed himself in his work at the asylum. He was determined to bring modern medical practices to the facility, to rid it of its dark past. But the deeper he delved into the asylum's history, the more he realized that something was profoundly wrong. Patients spoke of a shadow man, a figure that appeared in their nightmares, promising freedom in exchange for their souls. At first, Dr. Carlyle thought these were mere hallucinations, the product of troubled minds. But the consistency of their descriptions unsettled him. One particularly stormy night, Dr. Carlyle stayed late at the asylum, poring over Dr. Blackwood's old journals. The symbols he had seen earlier were there, drawn with meticulous precision. They seemed to be some kind of language or code, but their meaning eluded him. As he studied the pages, a low whispering filled the room. He looked up, but there was no one there. The shadows cast by the flickering candlelight seemed to dance and twist, almost as if they were alive. Back at the mansion, Lillian and Eliza were huddled in the parlor. The storm outside was fierce, lightning illuminating the sky in brief, blinding flashes. Eliza clutched her doll tightly, her eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, the rhythmic tapping began again, louder this time, echoing through the empty hallways. Lillian's heart raced as she took Eliza's hand and headed toward the source of the noise. They reached the basement door, which was slightly ajar. The tapping was louder now, almost deafening. Lillian hesitated but felt an inexplicable compulsion to descend the stairs. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. In the dim light of her lantern, she saw a figure hunched over an old, dusty piano in the corner. It was a man, his back to her, playing a haunting melody. His fingers moved with unnatural speed and precision, the music filling the air with an eerie resonance. "Who are you?" Lillian demanded, her voice trembling. The figure stopped playing and slowly turned to face her. It was Dr. Blackwood, his eyes hollow and his skin deathly pale. He smiled, but it was a smile devoid of warmth, a grimace more than anything. "Welcome, Mrs. Carlyle," he said in a voice that sent shivers down her spine. "I've been expecting you." Back at the asylum, Dr. Carlyle finally deciphered the symbols. They were part of an ancient ritual, a way to summon and bind malevolent spirits. He realized with horror that Dr. Blackwood had been conducting experiments not just on the patients but with forces far beyond human understanding. The Shadow Man was not a figment of their imagination but a real entity that Blackwood had summoned and failed to control. As the realization dawned on him, the asylum's lights flickered and went out. The whispering grew louder, and the shadows in the room coalesced into a single, terrifying form. The Shadow Man stood before him, tall and menacing, eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You have awakened me," it hissed. "And now, you must pay the price." Dr. Carlyle tried to run, but the shadows enveloped him, their icy grip paralyzing him with fear. He felt his life force being drained, his very soul being consumed by the darkness. At the mansion, Lillian screamed as Dr. Blackwood advanced toward her and Eliza. But just as he reached out to grab them, a blinding light filled the basement. The Shadow Man, having absorbed Dr. Carlyle's essence, was now free to roam the city. But before it could escape, Eliza's doll, a family heirloom, began to glow with an intense, radiant light. The doll had been passed down through generations, a protective talisman against evil. The Shadow Man recoiled, its form dissolving into nothingness. Dr. Blackwood let out a final, agonized scream before collapsing into a heap of dust. The storm outside ceased, and an eerie silence settled over the mansion. Lillian held Eliza close, tears streaming down her face. They had survived the night, but the horrors of Lancaster City were far from over. The asylum, now without a head physician, continued to stand as a beacon for all things dark and sinister. And in the shadows of the city, the echoes of the past lingered, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to uncover its secrets. As dawn broke over Lancaster, the city awoke, oblivious to the night's events. But for Lillian and Eliza, the memory of the Shadow Man and Dr. Blackwood would forever haunt their dreams, a reminder that some horrors are best left forgotten. They ran into a nearby alleyway, their hearts pounding with the adrenaline of what they had just experienced. They settled themselves down, sitting on a discarded couch that reeked of mildew and abandonment. Lillian clutched Eliza tightly, trying to calm her racing heart, while Eliza's wide eyes darted around, taking in their new surroundings. "We need to go over what just happened," Lillian said, her voice trembling. "We need to understand." "I don't know, Mother," Eliza whispered. It was so dark. As they discussed the details, piecing together the fragmented horrors they had witnessed, Lillian noticed a figure lingering above them. She glanced up, her breath catching in her throat. A young man, no older than 24, stood on the fire escape 2 floors above them. His eyes glowed unnaturally bright, even in the daylight, and his attire was a strange mix of normal clothing materials and armor, leather and lightweight steel. At his side hung a formidable M19 11.45 ACP caliber pistol, a relic of war that exuded both history and danger. "Who's there?" Lillian called out, her voice tinged with both fear and curiosity. The man regarded them silently for a moment, then kicked down a ladder with a practiced ease. The metal clanged loudly as it hit the ground, the sound echoing through the narrow alley. He gestured for them to climb up. "Join me," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. Lillian hesitated, but Eliza, sensing no immediate threat, tugged at her hand. "We should go, Mother." Reluctantly, Lillian helped Eliza up the ladder, following closely behind. They climbed onto the roof, where the young man awaited them. From this vantage point, they could see the city sprawled out below, its bustling streets oblivious to the dark undercurrents flowing beneath its surface. "So," the young man began, "we have talk of shadows." Lillian nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief at finding someone who seemed to understand. "Yes, shadows. We saw something. A man in our basement, and then shadows." The young man's expression hardened. "You're not the only ones. This city has a dark history, one that most people choose to ignore. But there are those of us who can see what others cannot. We call ourselves the Watchers." "Watchers?" Lillian echoed. "What do you watch for?" He glanced at Eliza, his glowing eyes softening slightly. "We watch for the shadows. The creatures that lurk in the darkness, feeding off fear and despair. They are drawn to places like this, places with a history of pain and suffering." Lillian shuddered. "The asylum?" "Yes," he confirmed. "The asylum is a focal point, a breeding ground for these entities. Dr. Blackwood was a fool who thought he could control them, but he only made things worse." Eliza spoke up, her voice small but steady. "My doll," it glowed. "It scared the shadow away." The young man nodded approvingly. "A talisman. Powerful and ancient. It protected you, but it also drew the attention of the shadows. They know you have it now. What do we do?" Lillian asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "How do we protect ourselves?" The young man considered for a moment, then drew his pistol, checking the ammunition. "You stay with me. I can teach you how to fight them, how to protect yourselves. But it won't be easy. These creatures are cunning and relentless." Lillian felt a spark of hope, albeit a small one. "Thank you. What's your name?" He hesitated before answering, as if weighing whether to share this part of himself. "Call me Asher." "Thank you, Asher," Lillian said, feeling a tentative sense of trust forming. "We'll do whatever it takes to keep Eliza safe." Asher nodded. "Good. We'll need to move quickly. The shadows won't stop until they get what they want." Together, they descended from the rooftop, Asher leading the way through the maze of alleyways. The city seemed different now, every shadow a potential threat, every darkened corner hiding unseen dangers. Lillian kept Eliza close, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. As they moved deeper into the city, Asher began to share his knowledge. He spoke of rituals and symbols, of ancient protections and modern weaponry. He taught them how to recognize the signs of a shadow's presence and how to ward them off with salt and iron. And as the days turned into weeks, Lillian and Eliza grew stronger, their fear slowly being replaced by resolve. But the shadows were always there, lurking at the edges of their vision, waiting for a moment of weakness. And as they prepared for the inevitable confrontation, they knew that the battle for Lancaster City had only just begun. The darkness was deep, and the shadows were many, but with Asher by their side, they felt a glimmer of hope. They walked into an old, crumbling building, its once grand facade now a husk of decayed memories and forgotten histories. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and dust, the remnants of a time long past. Asher led the way, his steps sure and purposeful, while Lillian and Eliza followed closely, their senses heightened by the pervasive sense of dread. "This place," Asher began, his voice echoing in the desolate hallways, "is one of many scattered throughout time. Humans have a way of repeating their history, their mistakes, and most tragically, their suffering. Sometimes, the suffering is so profound that it breaks time itself. The sheer weight of the pain and despair can fracture the very fabric of reality." Lillian listened intently, her grip on Eliza tightening. "What do you mean, break time?" Asher paused, turning to face them. "When the suffering becomes too great, it creates ripples, echoes that distort time and space. These disturbances allow the shadows to slip through, feeding on the agony and fear. The darkness spreads, and sometimes, even the strongest forces of good can't hold it back." They continued walking, the corridor opening into a vast chamber. The walls were lined with strange symbols and artifacts, remnants of countless battles fought against the encroaching darkness. In the center of the room stood a group of people, all bearing an uncanny resemblance to Asher. Their eyes glowed with the same eerie light, and their attire was a similar blend of modern and ancient armor. Lillian gasped, her mind struggling to comprehend the sight before her. Who are they?" Asher smiled, a rare expression that seemed almost out of place on his serious face. "They call me Asher, but my true name is Vanjik. We are all Vanjikis, connected across timelines and realities. The shadows broke through our timelines, and we have dedicated ourselves to fighting back. We train the citizens of each timeline to defend themselves against the shadows, to give these nightmares a reason to fear the dark." Eliza's eyes widened with curiosity. "You're all the same person?" "In a manner of speaking," Asher replied. "We share a common origin and purpose. Each of us has faced the shadows and emerged stronger, united by our mission to protect those who cannot protect themselves." One of the Vanjikis, a woman with a fierce determination in her eyes, stepped forward. "Welcome to the Watchers. Here, you will learn to harness your fear, to turn it into strength. We will teach you to fight, to survive, and to drive back the darkness." Lillian looked around, a sense of hope mingling with her fear. "What must we do?" "First," Asher said, "you must understand that this battle is not just physical, but also mental and emotional. The shadows feed on your fears, your doubts. You must confront these, and only then can you hope to defeat them." The Vanjikis began to instruct them, teaching them ancient rituals and modern tactics, methods to ward off the shadows and protect their minds from the insidious whispers of despair. Lillian and Eliza trained tirelessly, their bond strengthening as they learned to fight as a team. As the days turned into weeks, they became proficient in the arts of the Watchers. They learned to wield weapons and use protective charms, to read the signs of an impending shadow attack, and to fortify their minds against the creeping darkness. One evening, as they gathered around a fire in the heart of the building, Asher spoke again. "Remember, the shadows are relentless. They will stop at nothing to consume this world, to break the barriers between our timelines. But we are the Watchers. We exist to give these nightmares a reason to be afraid. We are the light in the darkness, the hope against despair." Lillian and Eliza nodded, their hearts steeled for the battles to come. They were no longer just survivors, they were warriors, ready to stand against the encroaching tide of shadows. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, the Vanjikis stood together, a united front against the terrors that lurked in the unseen corners of reality. And in that moment, Lillian knew that they had found their place, their purpose. They were Watchers, guardians of light in a world teetering on the edge of darkness, and they would fight until their last breath to protect their timeline from the shadows that sought to consume it. The night outside the old building grew colder, the stars obscured by a thick blanket of clouds. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The Vanjikis, a formidable force united by their shared mission, gathered closer to discuss their next move. Lillian and Eliza sat among them, their resolve growing with each passing moment. Asher stood, his eyes scanning the group. "Our timeline is not the only one under threat. The shadows are breaking through in other places, other times. We must be prepared to defend not just the city, but the very fabric of reality itself." One of the Vanjikis, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, spoke up. "We've received reports of shadow activity in the outskirts of the city. Strange occurrences, people disappearing. We need to investigate." Lillian felt a pang of fear, but she steeled herself. "We'll go with you," she said, her voice steady. "Eliza and I are ready." Asher nodded approvingly. "Good. We'll move out at dawn. Rest now, gather your strength." The group dispersed, each finding a place to rest. Lillian and Eliza settled into a corner, wrapping themselves in blankets. The weight of their new responsibilities pressed heavily on Lillian's mind, but she knew they had no choice. The safety of their world depended on their courage and determination. As dawn approached, the Vanjikis prepared for the mission. They armed themselves with a mix of ancient weapons and modern firearms, each tool carefully chosen for its effectiveness against the shadows. Asher handed Lillian a dagger etched with runes and a small pouch of salt. "These will help protect you," he said. "The dagger is enchanted, capable of wounding even the darkest entities. The salt can create barriers they cannot cross." Lillian accepted the gifts with a nod of gratitude. Eliza, now wearing a protective amulet, clutched her doll tightly. The group set out into the pre-dawn darkness, the city silent around them. As they moved through the deserted streets, the air grew colder, the shadows longer. They reached the outskirts of the city, where abandoned buildings and overgrown lots spoke of a past long forgotten. The sense of unease grew stronger, the shadows seeming to shift and writhe as if alive. Asher raised his hand, signaling the group to stop. "We need to be cautious," he whispered. "The shadows are close." They advanced slowly, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the night. The group tensed, weapons at the ready. From the darkness emerged a creature, its form twisted and unnatural, eyes glowing with malevolent light. Asher stepped forward, his pistol aimed at the creature. "Remember your training," he called out. "Stay together, and do not let fear control you." The creature lunged, and the battle began. The Vanjakis fought with a synchronized precision, their movements a blend of practiced skill and instinct. Lillian and Eliza stayed close, using their protective charms and weapons to fend off the smaller shadows that tried to flank them. Lillian's heart pounded as she parried a shadow's attack, her dagger cutting through the darkness with ease. Eliza's amulet glowed brightly, its light repelling the shadows that dared to come too close. The battle was fierce, but the Watchers held their ground, their determination unyielding. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the shadows began to retreat, their forms dissolving into the growing daylight. The creature let out a final, anguished roar before disintegrating into a cloud of dark mist. The Vanjakis stood victorious, their breaths coming in heavy gasps. Asher approached Lillian and Eliza, a proud smile on his face. "You fought well," he said. "You both have the heart of a Watcher." Lillian smiled back, exhaustion mingling with relief. "Thank you. We couldn't have done it without you." Asher nodded, his expression growing serious. "This is just the beginning. The shadows will return, stronger and more determined. But we will be ready." The group made their way back to the old building, the first rays of sunlight casting a warm glow on the city. As they walked, Lillian felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. They were Watchers, defenders of their timeline, and they would continue to fight, no matter the cost. Back at the building, they regrouped, tending to their wounds and sharing stories of the battle. The camaraderie among the Vanjakis was palpable, a bond forged in the crucible of shared danger and purpose. Lillian and Eliza were welcomed as part of the family, their bravery earning them the respect of their newfound allies. As the days turned into weeks, the training continued. Lillian and Eliza honed their skills, learning new techniques and strategies. They grew closer to the Vanjakis, understanding the depth of their commitment and the sacrifices they had made. The city, unaware of the battles fought in its shadows, went about its daily life, blissfully ignorant of the dangers lurking just out of sight. But the shadows never truly disappeared. They lingered, waiting for the next moment of weakness, the next opportunity to strike. And the Watchers remained vigilant, ever ready to protect their timeline from the encroaching darkness. In the heart of Lancaster City, a new dawn was rising. The Vanjakis stood as guardians, their presence a beacon of hope in a world teetering on the edge of despair. And as long as they stood together, they knew that the light would never be extinguished, no matter how deep the shadows grew. The days turned into months, and Lillian and Eliza became integral members of the Watchers. Their skills sharpened, and their bond with the Vanjakis deepened. Each mission, each battle, brought them closer to understanding the true nature of the shadows and the critical role they played in protecting their timeline. One crisp autumn evening, Asher gathered the Watchers in the grand hall of the old building. The air was filled with a sense of anticipation and resolve. He looked at each member, his gaze lingering on Lillian and Eliza. "The shadows have grown bolder," he began. "Their attacks are becoming more frequent and more organized. We have to strike at the heart of their presence in our timeline. Tonight, we launch an offensive to push them back and reclaim our city." The Watchers nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. They had faced countless battles, but this one felt different. It was a decisive moment, a chance to turn the tide in their favor. Asher led them through the darkened streets, the city silent under the cover of night. They moved with purpose, their footsteps echoing softly on the pavement. As they approached the outskirts, where the shadow's influence was strongest, a sense of foreboding settled over them. They reached an abandoned industrial complex, its looming structures shrouded in darkness. Asher signaled for the group to halt and turned to face them. "This is it," he said. "The Shadow's lair. Stay together, watch each other's backs, and remember your training." The Watchers advanced, their weapons at the ready. The complex was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, each filled with the oppressive presence of the shadows. They moved carefully, their senses heightened, every creak and whisper a potential threat. Suddenly, the shadows attacked. Dark forms surged from every corner, their eyes glowing with malevolence. The Watchers fought back with ferocity, their blades cutting through the darkness, their charms repelling the creatures. Lillian and Eliza stayed close, their movements synchronized, their resolve unshaken. The battle raged, the sounds of conflict echoing through the complex. Asher led the charge, his pistol and blade flashing in the dim light. The shadows were relentless, but the Watchers held their ground, their determination unyielding. In the heart of the complex, they found the source of the shadow's power, a pulsating, dark orb that seemed to draw in the surrounding light. Asher pointed to it. "Destroy the orb, and the shadows will weaken." Lillian and Eliza moved toward the orb, their weapons ready. As they approached, the shadows intensified their assault, desperate to protect their source of power. The Watchers formed a protective circle around them, fighting off the relentless onslaught. With a final, coordinated effort, Lillian and Eliza struck the orb, their enchanted blades piercing its dark surface. The orb shattered with a deafening roar, releasing a burst of light that momentarily blinded them. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissipating into the air, their power broken. As the light faded, the complex fell silent. The shadows were gone, their presence reduced to mere whispers. The Watchers stood victorious, their breaths heavy, their bodies exhausted but triumphant. Asher approached Lillian and Eliza, his face lit with pride. "You did it," he said. "The city is safe, for now." Lillian smiled, the weight of their victory sinking in. "We couldn't have done it without you," she replied. "Without all of you." The Watchers returned to their headquarters, the dawn breaking over the city. The light of the new day felt warmer, more hopeful. The citizens of Lancaster City went about their day, unaware of the battle that had raged in the shadows, oblivious to the dangers that had been averted. Ashur addressed the group one last time. "We have won a great battle, but our fight is far from over. The shadows will return, but so will we. We are the Watchers, and we will protect the city, this timeline, with everything we have." Lillian and Eliza stood with the Vanjikis, their hearts filled with a sense of purpose and belonging. They had found their place in the fight against the darkness, and they knew that as long as they stood together, the light would never be extinguished. In the heart of Lancaster City, the Watchers remained vigilant, ever ready to defend against the shadows. And as the city thrived under the protective gaze of its unseen guardians, the legacy of the Vanjikis continued, a beacon of hope in a world forever haunted by the echoes of suffering and despair. As the weeks turned into months, and the city slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, Lillian and Eliza found a new rhythm in their lives. They continued their training with the Watchers, their skills honed to a razor's edge, but they also began to rebuild the life they had nearly lost to the shadows. One crisp winter morning, as snow lightly dusted the rooftops of Lancaster City, Ashur called a meeting. The Watchers gathered in the grand hall, their expressions a mix of anticipation and solemnity. "We've made significant progress," Ashur began, his voice carrying a note of both pride and caution. "The shadows have been driven back, their presence in our timeline weakened. But they are not gone, and they will always seek to return." He looked around at the faces of his comrades, lingering on Lillian and Eliza. "It's time to consider the future. We've done well, but we must remain vigilant. This city will always need its protectors." Lillian stepped forward, her hand resting on Eliza's shoulder. "We've found our place here," she said, her voice firm. "We'll stay, and we'll continue to fight. For Eliza, for everyone." The room fell silent as Ashur nodded. "Then we will stand together, as we always have. We are the Watchers, and we will never falter." The group disbanded, each member returning to their duties. Lillian and Eliza walked through the snow-covered streets, the chill air invigorating their spirits. The city seemed brighter, more alive, as if the very air had been cleansed of its lingering darkness. They stopped at a small park, where children played in the snow and families strolled beneath the bare trees. Lillian watched them, her heart swelling with a sense of peace and purpose. Eliza looked up at her, a smile spreading across her face. "Do you think the shadows will come back, Mother?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and a hint of fear. Lillian knelt down, pulling Eliza into a warm embrace. "They might, Eliza. But we know how to fight them now. We have each other, and we have the Watchers. We'll always be ready." Eliza nodded, her confidence bolstered by her mother's words. They stood together for a while, watching the world go by, the warmth of their bond a shield against the cold and the darkness. As the sun set, casting a golden hue over the city, Lillian and Eliza returned to the Watchers' headquarters. They joined the others around a large table, where plans were being made, strategies discussed. The future was uncertain, but they were ready to face it, together. And so, Lancaster City continued to thrive under the watchful eyes of its guardians. The Vanjikis, united across time and space, stood as a bulwark against the encroaching shadows. Their legacy lived on, a testament to the strength and resilience of those who dared to stand against the darkness. In the end, it was not just the battles won or the shadows defeated that defined them, but the unwavering spirit of hope and courage that bound them together. The Watchers would always be there, vigilant and steadfast, a light in the darkness, ensuring that the nightmares had a reason to be afraid. For as long as there were shadows, there would be Watchers. And as long as there were Watchers, the light would never fade.